outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hi, and welcome to the Late Late Show with me, Seema Agarwal. So this is our launch show, and we've got some really exciting stuff lined up for you today. So just to tell you a little bit about me, I'm a senior lecturer at a university in London. I teach on both BA and MA advertising. And I came into teaching from industry. So I did quite a lot of guest lecturing while I was working in the industry. My last gig was at Disney Theatrical, where I looked after their digital advertising for the UK for Aladdin the Musical and The Lion King. But I'm really, really excited to be back on radio in a totally different context, and one that I'm massively passionate about, which is education. So I've got two very cool personalities joining me on the show today, and they'll also each be challenging each other, as well as delivering you a mini masterclass each, which I'll tell you more about later. So coming to the topic for the show today. Now, in UK higher education, I think that using academic sources is very much an expectation and something that is aligned with maintaining good academic standards. And I think that this is probably something that's been brought into question, especially as we look more at the function and the role of universities and what constitutes good quality teaching. So today, the question I'm asking is whether teaching without an academic source is still credible. And I love this question because when I came to teach at a university, I found that the department was a mix of practitioners and academics. And I very quickly realized that there was this sort of tension that existed between the two. And I think it's one of those unspoken things. And if I really reduce it down to the basics, it's maybe a difference in ideas about what is valuable to teach the students. And I know that this is an opinion that definitely I've spoken to others in the field, and they've observed that similar kind of tension between the academics and the practitioners. So I thought that this would be a really interesting question to start with. Just as an example, I remember teaching on a unit once, and I was asked to teach some of the theories and frameworks around digital marketing. And my colleague said to me that those frameworks had to come from the core textbook for the unit. So I remember I was sitting at home, I was preparing this lecture, and I went through the chapter on this area in the textbook. And I remember thinking, okay, this book was only written a couple of years ago, but we don't actually use any of these frameworks in industry. And half of them I'd actually never heard of. But then some of the ones that I hadn't heard of or used in my working career, they actually seemed quite interesting and potentially valuable to try out. But then I also had this kind of conflict because the things that I wanted to teach in response to that topic were these frameworks and methods that were probably, I don't know, invented by someone randomly and passed around the industry. And I'd used them lots of times, so I knew that they worked, but they didn't necessarily have an academic basis or exist in a textbook that I could then reference. And then if I taught the textbook ones, I didn't really believe in them. And so that conflicted with my ability to teach with conviction. So I don't think that there's like a straight answer to this topic. And I guess that the industry and the context can probably make quite a significant difference to the answer to this question as well. But I guess I wanted to start with this topic because I don't really have a concrete opinion on it. And when I was thinking about topics for the show that I wanted to discuss, there's quite a few that I definitely have a very firm kind of standpoint on. But I want to talk about these things and explore them and unpick them as we go along with people that I think are good at what they do, extremely credible, and people that are opinionated but open-minded as well, which is how I describe my two guests today. So when I was leading on a unit called Behavioural Insights, I collaborated with Dr. Adrian Sledmere, who I would say traditionally, and he might correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say he traditionally fits the criteria of being an academic. And when I worked with Adrian, I thought our work on that unit was a shining example of how both perspectives add value and can actually work really well together. But I also feel that this was quite a unique experience, and I haven't found that it usually happens this way. So I think Adrian has this great ability to make students curious and to really bring academic theory to life, which is basically good teaching. So I'd like to welcome my first guest, Adrian. Hi, Adrian.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for being on the show. So do you want to tell everyone a bit about yourself?
Well, yes. I mean, firstly, a mild correction, really. I would say I am an academic. However, my journey into academia only began really in my late 30s after a long career in playing music. Hence my avatar there with which you guys can see, but probably no one else can. And so I was working as a musician, producer, and guitar player. But I had a huge amount of questions about the industry that I worked in and about life in general. And not having been to university, I went very late on in life. And so in some senses, my interest in academia was directly in response to questions that I had about life. I didn't sort of go into it at 18. As many academics do, they start their academic careers at university and they go straight into teaching. I had this kind of body of experience that I wanted to really make sense out of. And I found that the more I looked at the idea of going to university and studying, the more books that I began to acquire from local bookshops, the more I got kind of not obsessed, but the more I wanted to get involved with developing my knowledge and learning what other people had written about life, about society, about music, and how I could use that to develop my own ideas. So that was kind of really my career trajectory. Originally, I had started my working career in insurance and then advertising, but then had gone off to do touring and to work in other things. I even worked on cruise ships. I've done all kinds of different things playing music. And it really was upon those experiences that I sort of desperately wanted to sort of build and develop my knowledge. So everything that I learned at university, all of the theories, all of the anthropology, all of the media studies and social sciences, was really something, to me, it was fascinating from outset. And I think that possibly being a mature student helped me a great deal and gave me the kind of the energy. I had a lot of questions about life that I wanted to answer. So that's really been my background. And from that point onwards, I've sort of slowly made a transition away from doing music, which I still do to some extent, but more involved with teaching and developing my own research, academic research, which has been chiefly about music, but also music and advertising and music and branding. I'm particularly interested in those areas. Yeah, go on.
No, go on. You carry on.
And that's me really. So I do. You're right to some extent. I think I would fit the mold of an academic in the context where we first met, because I was teaching theoretical classes and I was teaching theory, as opposed to many of my colleagues who were mainly involved with teaching industry-related subjects. I would sometimes cross over into those areas, but it was mainly academic. So I was well versed, and I could also understand with some sympathy the experience of colleagues who were brought in to teach more vocationally orientated lectures. but in an academic context. And I could understand that tension very early on. And it was something that had existed on some of the degree courses that I had taught, not only at the college where we first met, but also, for instance, at I taught for a long time at a drama college and had responsibility for delivering the academic side or the academic studies side of a degree program to students who were in theatre arts. In other words, these were students who were doing lighting design, costume production, theatre design, but had obviously to have an academic component to their degrees in order to get them. And similarly, there was a certain amount of tension within those particular degrees that I've experienced at other colleges. And clearly, a lot of colleges now are more vocationally orientated, and they are offering degrees, and degrees have a certain gravitas. Otherwise, they wouldn't be degrees, and they need to have an academic component to them. So there is always potentially that tension, and that is a challenge to teachers, I think, is how do you, if you can put it this way, how do you sell the idea of theory and academia to students, quite possibly when those students are more vocationally orientated? That is a challenge. So that's me, really. I can waffle on for ages, but I'm sure you probably want to introduce Kent as well. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so interesting to hear about the sort of journey and the trajectory before you came into academia. I keep hearing recently about this thing called a squiggly career path, where people don't have necessarily a conventional route into what they do. And I do find that very interesting. I'd say that you've probably had that as well. And yes, I want to get more into discussing the tension that you've talked about, which interestingly does go across other industries too. But one of the things I want to do first is, of course, to introduce my next guest. So quite often I call my industry friends in to come and teach on our course. And one of those people is our next guest, which is Kent Valentine, who over the last few years has come in and taught on both our BA and our MA. And he's been a big hit with the students. So he's pretty much a regular on the course. One of his many side hustles was as a stand-up comedian. So yeah, I've got a musician and a stand-up comedian, which is great. It's no wonder that he's got this infectious energy and a very natural way with teaching. So hi, Kent, welcome onto the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So yeah, tell everyone a bit about yourself.
So I'm Australian, and I grew up in a I guess what was a country, well, it wasn't a country town, it was a coastal town, but I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. So I went out into the country and studied theatre at probably something, a course that sounds quite similar to what Adrian was teaching, this weird mix of vocational and academic, and then graduated being completely unemployable with a theatre degree. And so I went into advertising as well in the fledgling digital space. And at the same time as I did that, I started a stand-up comedy room in Sydney. So I always had these parallel pursuits going, one that paid money and one that drained money. And over time, the money drain eclipsed the money earner for its earning capacity. And I switched over and started doing stand-up full-time and doing digital media advertising as a side hustle. And I moved over to the UK, and that was all fine and dandy, just doing stand-up full-time. This is one of the few places in the world where you can actually do that in a sustainable way. You can do stand-up and not have to do something on the side. It's really, one of the best things about this country. But as soon as we had 2 children, that became unsustainable. Being on the road 6 nights a week is just really difficult on any kind of relationship, and it's hard to be present. So I went back to agency life and stayed with an agency for about 7 years, and then the industry really shifted underneath us, and we ended up selling our agency to a management consultancy, which is where I live these days. So I feel very out of my depth academically. So, you know, within a management consultancy, you know, it's a really kind of quantity space. It's been really eye-opening. I've been there for the last 8 years. I lead our London office, which is one of the hats that I wear. And the other hat that I wear is I design and facilitate collaborative sessions with clients. So if you've got a group of business leaders who have very different opinions about a really important topic that's make or break, then you kind of wheel me out and I come in and help facilitate a conversation so that everybody can get facing in the same direction, hopefully without blood on the floor. And one of the things that I get to do, which is really wonderful, is a little bit of radio, which is lovely. I've had radio sort of scattered throughout my career, and I really love coming back to this medium, and teaching via yourself and Paul at UAL, which has been fantastic because I love teaching. And one of my only regrets is that I didn't do the one extension year to my degree so that I could teach, because I've really enjoyed it whenever I've had the chance. I'm one of the faculty at our firm, and I love delivering teaching. I love giving people skills that they can implement immediately and that are immediately relevant to their life and that shift the way that they think about things that they already think are fixed, which is really satisfying. And, you know, one of my joys every year is coming to teach on either the BA or the MA class, especially because they're really fun topics, especially like iteration, which is what we did this year. And being able to run those sessions with people and have them go in 1 3-hour session from being quite blasé about a topic to really interested in a topic and playing around and experimenting with it is super fun. So super excited to be here and happy to chat.
Yeah, no, and I think it's true. The students have always really loved the practical nature of your sessions. That's something that they consistently talk about as being valuable. So, we'll dig more into this. I think I want to start by actually just getting a direct answer to the question from each of you. But before I do that, I just want to also mention that this show has been brought to you all in partnership with John Catt Educational. They are publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So if you want to sort of level up your professional development, you can visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. And if you want to get 20% off your first order, you can use the code JCTTR2425. Also, if you haven't subscribed to our TTR weekly newsletter yet, then make sure you do that. It's called Soundbites and Insights, and it's delivered to 10,000 educators a week. It has a sort of curated selection of 4 of our standout shows from the week, loads of exclusive discounts and offers from our sponsors. So you can sign up on the website, which is it's ttradio.org/newsletter. So let's start with an answer to the question. Now, I can't decide who should go first. And when I was, I've always been a big Radiohead. And when I was growing up, one of my favorite features was this thing called Guess the Sound. Do you guys, are you Radioheads? Did you used to like listen to stuff like this, or was it just me?
No, we had that in Australia.
Yeah. Awesome.
Secret sound.
So just for fun, we're going to play Guess the Sound, and whoever gets it right or is closest to it can answer the question first. So are you ready for the sound? Here it is. Hang on.
Spoon in a bowl.
Yes. Oh my God, that was so good. How did you get that so quickly? I thought that was going to be quite difficult.
Does that mean that Kent doesn't get to go first?
That means Kent gets to go first. So Kent, what do you think? is teaching without an academic source still credible?
Well, I'd say yes, but I'm very much at one end of a spectrum in terms of how I teach and what I teach. But one of the things that I've learned is everything in moderation. And I find that when I work with people, I always try and complement myself with someone that is a very different style to me and teaches in a really different way. And so I think in cases like this, I think that both are super relevant and super useful. And while I think it's possible to teach without academic sources, I think for some people to feel like, you know, that what they're getting is the real deal, it can be really useful. So, you know, I'm actually on the line. I think you can do without, but you're probably better with you know, kind of both ways.
And before I get Adrian to answer the question, let me just quickly ask you, Kent, when you come in and you teach on the BA and the MA, what are your sources? What do you use?
So interestingly, I mean, I use techniques. I'm teaching primarily techniques which I use in the wild. So I'm teaching techniques that I use directly with clients. Some of those will come from academic sources. So my favorite thing ever, like my favorite technique of or little trick or like a tool or framework for thinking that I use everywhere comes from an academic source, but some things don't. Some things are bastardized versions of exercises which might have come out of things like design thinking, which we've changed. I'm very much a magpie when it comes to my tools and techniques. For my work, I shamelessly steal and bastardize and adapt. And so what I tend to teach is that patchwork of techniques, which I think if someone were versed in the theoretical underpinnings of the kind of things that I do, they would recognize some things more easily than others. But it's, you know, this is more like the Millennium Falcon than a kind of stock standard, you know, straight off the production line type of idea. You know, this has been cobbled together and you know, it's generations of things tacked on and knocked off and damaged and fixed with spit and gaffer tape.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess that's the way that people do things in industry, right? They take bits of models and frameworks that work, and then they can turn it into something else and make it work for this client or this particular case study. So yeah, that kind of patchwork of techniques, as you say, that's quite interesting. Adrian, I'm going to come to you. So tell me, what's your sort of direct answer to that question?
Well, I'm going to be similarly on the fence, really, and vague. And you know, in the words of Blackadder, is teaching without an academic source still credible? He might say, well, yes, but also no. And I think the much when I started to think about this question, I thought this is really a question that relates to the context, and it relates to what you're delivering and to whom, really. It's a very, very obvious set of kind of considerations. If you are talking, for instance, about the subject of authenticity in popular music, for instance, there is an entire body of work that you really do have to engage with or acknowledge before you can talk about it with any authority to a group of students. However, if you're teaching something that I think that is essentially vocational, say, for instance, as I think I mentioned to you guys earlier, the subject of plumbing, for instance, there is not a huge academic body of knowledge that concerns plumbing. And I'm not being deliberate. I'm not sort of being glib about this or facetious about it. It's perhaps not surprising that there isn't, but the reason would be is because when it is taught, very often it is done visually, and it's very self-evident, and there are particular ways of doing things, and it doesn't necessarily need a huge body of research behind it to explain it and justify it. Whereas I think if you're looking at something like English literature or sociology or any of the social sciences, then that is a different kind of kettle of fish. And in that context, I think it is probably more important that you are using academic sources, because ultimately what you're going to ask the students to do with their assignments is going to replicate the kind of research conventions and processes of those particular disciplines. And therefore you have to kind of lead by example, I think, and to use academic sources. I'm sorry if that's a little bit, so go on.
Yeah, on that note, Adrian, can you just explain a bit about what qualifies as an academic source?
Yeah, well, an academic research or an academic source is usually takes the form of something called a journal article. And these are articles published in established journals by academics, for academics and for students. And very importantly, the research that gets published in these journals has to be of a very high rigorous standard, and it's subject to something called the peer review process. So in other words, if I submit an article, as I have done recently, to Popular Music and Society, I can expect to have that reviewed not only by editors, but also it'll get sent out to a couple of other academics, and they will give their comments on it. And this can be quite a harsh and rigorous process sometimes. But what it does is to ensure that there are kind of limits to what people can say, and that they must be able to justify the evidence that they're presenting. They must be able to justify their theories on a particular subject with reference to what has been written before. So those journal articles, I've just mentioned one of them there, for instance, Popular Music and Society, but you're going to find them, you're going to find a lot of them in relation to advertising and marketing. I think that is a slightly different discipline, which has some of its own codes and conventions, but essentially the process is the same. You also find academic sources in the form of book chapters. So you might get an anthology of essays about a particular subject by different academics. So that's very often a common source. You would find conference papers. You might go to an academic conference, and very often academics like to road test their ideas before a relatively friendly but equally critical audience. That's a very useful thing to do for them. And also you can go online and you can look at student postgraduate research. You can look at PhD theses and master's theses online at many different colleges. So I think it's quite important to sort of emphasize here that it's not only academics and teachers who are part of this kind of wider body of knowledge, but also students as well. And that was something I always try and get across to students, is that when you're doing a bit of research, when you're doing your dissertation, you are part of that same august body of research that the person who's delivering lectures to you is. And sometimes students actually they begin to get a little bit more enthusiastic sometimes about the idea of doing a dissertation if they realize that it has that value to it. So those are the traditional sources. I think it's important to talk about academic sources, or to talk about sources really in terms of their provenance. So the things that I have mentioned are really kind of at the top of the tree, but of course there is a whole body of knowledge beneath that you can get from government reports, from newspapers, online, and various other sources. But you tend to have a kind of hierarchy of credibility when it comes to academic work. And if you are engaging with a particular topic, you do really have to engage with what has already gone before and what has been written about academic research, about a particular subject that you want to talk about.
Sorry, go on. Are you?
Yeah, and I think one thing that I came across the other day, in a completely different context, is I'm reading Middlemarch at the moment. I don't know if anybody has read that by George Eliot. And you think, oh God, why is he going to blather on about Middlemarch? But very interestingly, and Middlemarch is talking about a period of history around 1830. So it's kind of post-Enlightenment, sort of getting into the Romantic period. However, one of the main characters in that book is an academic theologian called Edward Casaubon, who is writing his ultimate piece of academic work, which is called A Key to All Mythologies. And this becomes pivotal to the plot of the book in some ways, because it transpires that his whole project is flawed because he doesn't speak German and therefore is not up to date with the latest research concerning mythologies. So, in other words, even if you go back 200 years ago to George Eliot and Middlemarch, you can see that already in academic circles, it was considered important, if you wanted to hold forth about a particular subject, that you had a good comprehensive knowledge of the debates and ideas that circulated within that field. Now, obviously, that's not always going to be the case, and it depends very much what you're talking about. If you are teaching something that's marketing related or advertising related, yes, there is a body. There is going to be a body of research that you can draw upon. But I would imagine in those areas you're going to have slightly more leeway in terms of drawing upon your own practical experience and your own ideas, because that's essentially what I think a lot of students are paying for anyway, is to hear your kind of unique take on the subject. So anyway, I'm taking liberties there a little bit.
That's okay. Ken, you've spent a lot of your career in the kind of worlds of marketing and advertising. So what do you think? I mean, I know you can't speak for the whole industry, but coming from the industry, what do you think the sort of internal perspective is on academic sources? Do you find that you and your colleagues are keeping up to speed with these kind of things, or including them in what you use to stay abreast of what's going on in the industry, or are they considered outdated? Like, what do you think the perspective is?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And I think I really need to preface my answer with, I'm not a typical representative of the marketing industry, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I think certainly there were some people who did a sister degree to me, an advertising degree, and went straight into advertising via a graduate program. And I think it was different for me because I was in digital, and digital was, very much the Wild West. This is, 2001, 2002. So it wasn't so much advertising as taking advertising principles and applying them to emerging digital technologies. And in that time, we certainly weren't looking back at academic texts and seeing what was being written about that. There were people within the agency who had academic backgrounds in terms of advertising, and they would be involved in the process. But it was as much technology led as anything, certainly at that period of time. When I think about what I do now in terms of management consultancy, and there are lots of different techniques, that is a big, being a consultant draws on lots of different disciplines, from economics, history, politics, organizational psychology. While people have a lot of training in that background, a lot of the access to academic study, I think, would probably primarily come through business books, which are taking an academic body of knowledge and then popularizing them to a degree. So I think that, you know, popular science, popular psychology, even self-help books, which have an academic grounding, as much as anything, will shape a lot of the thinking and a lot of the techniques in these fields, because when you're referencing something that a client has also, you know, especially when you're working with clients, when you're referencing something that a client recognizes, perhaps a book they've read, and then you can speak to the, you know, the kind of academic knowledge underneath it, but it'll be the book that will have brought that topic to them rather than the knowledge itself. And then in my particular, you know, space specifically, it's just about what works. I'm standing in front of a group of people, and I'm working with those people to elicit specific outcomes. And, you know, at that point, it doesn't matter what it says in a book. It doesn't matter what's written in an article. The only thing that matters is what I can get out of those people in the room. And I think the quality with which I can do that would be vastly improved if I had a much greater academic background to draw on. You know, my toolbox would probably be broader, but all of those tools have been modified for use. None of them have come straight out of academia and into the toolbox without, you know, a degree of modification. Sometimes it's a little bit of modification, and sometimes it's with a lot of modification, but nothing survives the transition into the real world without, you know, nothing survives that contact with reality without a certain amount of editing and retooling to knock the edges off and make it really workable.
I really think that idea of what works for the group of the people in the room is very interesting. And Adrian, I'd like to sort of get your take on, if we took that into an academic sort of context, let's say we take that into a classroom, what works for the group of people in the room, what would the implications of that be in an academic setting?
I think again, it depends very much on the context in which you're kind of
I know, yeah.
What you actually deliver. My experience, in my own research, I've actually sort of straddled a number of different disciplines. You know, a lot of my research was into popular music and political economy. So I've looked at sort of all the traditional areas that you get in sociology and social sciences. However, I've also delivered sort of material to PR students and to advertising students, as I'm sure you're aware. And so I'm equally aware that there is a substantial body of marketing and advertising theoretical material, but those areas compared to certain other areas like the social sciences, I think are relatively new, and those bodies of knowledge are rapidly developing. PR is a very good example, for instance, in that there aren't a huge amount of textbooks compared to, say, the field of English literature or literary criticism when you're looking at PR. So these areas are quite new. And also I think that with advertising and, say, branding, the kind of discipline of marketing comes from a more kind of business school orientation, which I think is really partly what Kent's alluding to there. And that is a different body of knowledge, very often dealing with particular theories, models, and ideas that can be drawn upon in a classroom situation to lend authority. But my experience of reading a lot of those things, and I have to be really cautious about how I say this because I wouldn't want to upset anybody, very often I found reading some of that academic material to be practically orientated, but quite obvious in many ways. But in all fields, whether or not it's marketing, advertising, whether or not it's the social sciences, whatever you can do to support and add, and it is a question of authority, really, because what you're saying is, look, don't take my word for it. this is what so and so, who is a well-known figure, has said about it. This is what a certain academic has said, and you want to be able to do that if you can to support your point. But I don't think it's necessarily essential, particularly when you are talking about something which has a very practical application and where ultimately you've got results that you want to get. And with advertising and marketing, you are in the business of really teaching people or helping people to sell something, which is quite different to achieving a Marxist understanding of theatre, for instance, which has perhaps not the same, it might have a revolutionary agenda, but it doesn't have the same set of practical objectives. And therefore, I think it is different in that sense. There are parallels, but it is essentially different based upon what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is different, but then I don't think that is necessarily recognized by institutions. So I don't think there's necessarily a sort of acknowledgement that this is a more practical degree, and therefore it's fine to go away from using academic sources. Or would you disagree?
No, I agree with you, and I think, as I was saying earlier, really, that when somebody's walking away from a college, whether or not it's, whether or not you've done English literature at Cambridge, or whether or not you've done a more kind of vocationally orientated degree, it is at the end of the day a degree. So every degree has got to have hardwired into it a certain amount of academic material and academic study. I think it's quite difficult to have a degree where you don't have that. So not surprisingly, institutions and universities and colleges are going to have a certain emphasis on that. And also bear in mind that the recent colleges are funded partly via the quality and the breadth and extent of their research and publishing is important to their income, but also to their whole raison d'etre. Most universities are defined to an extent by the research that they do. So it's not surprising, not only in terms of delivering a degree, but also the cultural milieu that you're going to teach in, if you teach at a university, is going to be research orientated, and part of its income does depend upon that. I think that's an important point to mention. And so it's not surprising that people who have published a great deal, for instance, that is quite important to their kind of career development within academia and within universities, and how they progress through those institutions is quite important. So you might find, possibly in some institutions, that there is a little bit of tension there in terms of staff who are delivering more practically orientated subject, and people who are dealing more with what you might call pure rather than applied knowledge, which is a kind of dichotomy that you get between different types of knowledge. And I think that with some academic subjects, you're more skewed towards pure knowledge, almost like saying knowledge for its own sake, rather than applied knowledge. And I think when you kind of understand and acknowledge the difference between those different knowledges, you can get to the core of how the delivery can be different, and whether or not indeed you do need to cite academic sources. I think for people, if you are teaching in any situation, it's fine, I think, to draw upon your own experience. And I think that, in recent years, lived experience has become, a more acknowledged source of knowledge and expertise, more than perhaps in previous eras. It is important to draw upon that. And certainly if I was a student studying advertising, I would desperately want to engage with practitioners who could bring their own anecdotal experience and their own practical experience. And I would be fully willing to accept that there wasn't necessarily a source to support the truths that were being presented to me in that particular context.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is very valuable, and the students are always sort of crying out for more people like Kent to come in and to sort of share their knowledge and their experiences and how what they're learning actually applies to the real world.
Yes.
So I just want to give you each an opportunity to ask each other a question as well, because I'm just aware that I don't know how time goes so quickly. But would you like to ask Kent anything, Adrian?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you draw a great deal upon the kind of that body of research that falls under the heading of marketing or advertising academic research? Would you routinely use material or cite quotations from that in your lectures? Or is it quite possible that you would deliver a lecture and you wouldn't introduce any quotations or citations at all?
So, I mean, it's a great question. I tend to teach, so I don't teach marketing. I might be lecturing in a marketing course, but I tend to be teaching, and I think this comes down to your distinction about whether it's applied knowledge. I tend to work more in the applied knowledge. What I'm teaching people is techniques that they can apply to their projects and assignments. So I'm teaching them how to do things. And I guess one of the reasons why I feel like very often I can get away with teaching from experience is because I can demonstrate live, and this is probably why there isn't a body of knowledge about plumbing, academic knowledge, is that with plumbing, if you're demonstrating something, you can demonstrate the truth of the claim immediately. It can be borne out by observation of the system right then and there. No need to run a huge experiment with lots of people, because you can show the truth of the situation right there. And I think in many cases, the same can be said of some of the techniques that that I would teach groups of people. What I do is, if I'm designing something, for example, a workshop, I will often research what existing academic literature might say about something that I've heard from someone else. So, for example, the first time that I encountered pre-mortems, one of the first things I did was Google pre-mortems, figure out where they came from, and found that there was a body of research about them. And so sometimes I cite that research, sometimes I don't. More often than not, I probably don't, because it's not important where pre-mortems come from. What's important is that they work, and that, for the people that I'm teaching, they are a technique that is used extensively in business, and it yields real world results. The fact that there is academic literature to back that up is useful, but not necessarily necessary within the context in which I'm teaching. I'm sure that some of the students, though, would love more rigor around that from me. And maybe they'll get that over time. And certainly this conversation has actually been really useful for making me think a little bit more about that. It's not something that I've thought about deeply. But I wouldn't necessarily bring it unless I thought that it added something that I would be missing if I omitted the reference. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes, yeah, I completely agree, and much of it just, if you're teaching something that is related, very much kind of rooted in the outside world and in the world of commerce and business, that is quite different to arguing different kind of, or looking at different takes on Marxist theory, which there is too much probably written about Marxism and Marxist theory, because Marx was putting out there that there were these number of different concepts and his ideas about how capital worked and all the rest of it, which have been disputed and debated ever since. And it's very, very, very difficult to actually prove and to sort of say, well, actually, Marx has been, it's been proved to be correct because this is what we now know empirically about ideology, all of these different things. I think where you are dealing with a lot of abstract concepts that are not rooted in the outside world, it becomes almost more necessary to bring on these different voices supported by quotation in order to develop a particular debate. Whereas if you're dealing with something that's more practical and where you've got direct experience of what does and doesn't work, that's quite a different set of considerations.
Yeah.
I think that actually shows as well why that tension exists in the first place, because as Kent mentioned, it's not something he would have necessarily thought about. He's thinking about it now, but he wouldn't have perhaps considered that beforehand, right? And I think that a lot of practitioners that come and teach in universities probably haven't thought too much about the integration of academia and academic sources, and then if what they're teaching is sort of what works for the room, then until sort of someone taps on their shoulder and says, well, actually, I think that, you know, there needs to be a reference for this and a textbook that you can take this from, it's perhaps not something that a practitioner would naturally think about.
Yeah, and I think if you zoom out from this question, what you find is that there are fundamental questions we're asking here that are kind of what I would describe with my academic hat on as epistemological. In other words, how do we know what knowledge is? How do we know what truth is? How do we know what reality is?
Yeah.
And essentially, those objectives remain the same. They lie at the back. Those essential questions lie at the back of what each of us is trying to do in a university teaching context, but we're coming at it from slightly different histories and slightly different directions. And I think if you were, I mean, say if Kent wanted to publish, you know, a formal paper about any of his material or any ideas he had, then you would get involved in that peer review process, and all of a sudden you would find more of an impetus to find citations and academic sources to support and present your material. In the classroom, it's important, but I think it's not quite as important as it is within academia. That makes sense.
It does. So just to sort of close off the debate part, Ken, would you like to ask Adrian anything?
Yeah, I think I guess I'd love to know if there are situations where it's been inconvenient to cite the academic sources. Sorry, that is my dog in the background lapping up some water. I don't know what it sounds like to people that can't see this, but it always sounds obscene from where I am if you don't have any context. Yeah, I'd love to know when it's actually been inconvenient, or unhelpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've tended in my teaching, sometimes to my detriment and possibly getting myself into trouble on occasions, to draw very heavily upon anecdotal material and to draw upon humour as well in order to get certain ideas across. Because I think that it's one thing to present material, but I think it's also extremely difficult to inspire students sometimes to get as enthusiastic about a particular topic as you are. In other words, essentially trying to sort of sell it. So I think there have been occasions where I have realized that I have prepared much too much material. I will have, you know, it's like kind of Seth Godin's pronouncements about PowerPoint and having way too much material on them and lots of quotations. And I've realized after a while, partly I'm doing that for myself because I see the lectures as me researching and educating and getting interested and enthusiastic about a particular topic, but perhaps losing sight of what it is that the students are going to experience. So I think that in many ways, the more you can pare back lectures and sometimes not rely on quotations and have them just for the sake of it, I think it's important to get a really good balance in one's teaching. And to use quotations to establish a certain degree of authority, but not to rely on them too much in a lecture situation, or citations or academic sources. I think they can be there, but they're not perhaps one of them. They're not necessarily the most important thing when you're delivering material to students. I think one of the most important things is to inspire, and that sounds like a really cheesy, unoriginal thing to say about teaching, but it's something of getting that energy across and that enthusiasm to students. And if you can bring on other voices to help convey that enthusiasm, then have at it. But I don't think it's always essential.
Yeah, I also love what you said there, Adrian, about when you're preparing for classes, and it's almost like your own research process going into that. I think all of us, by the way, over prepare and have way too many materials, but that's definitely a topic for another show. So look, I think this has been a really, really interesting debate, and it's been really great to get each of your perspectives, because you do come from very different worlds, but yet there are a lot of kind of parallels and overlaps between what each of you think and what your experiences have been in this regard. So one of the things that I want to do on all of our shows, especially because we've got such great guests on the shows, is to give each guest an opportunity to teach a very quick kind of like 3-minute masterclass on anything of their choice, just to give the listeners something different. And so, Adrian, I'd like you to go first, but just while you prepare that, if any of you out there are looking for another great education podcast, do check out Chalk and Talk with Anna Stoke. Anna's a passionate advocate for evidence-based math education for students of all ages. And on her podcast, she talks about everything from effective teaching methods and how-to guides for teaching math facts to tips for evaluating research shows claims. And she brings on top-notch guests, educators, researchers, policymakers, and she discusses issues that directly impact teachers and students. So Chalk and Talk is for anyone that's interested in education, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Adrian, over to you. What are you going to teach us?
Okay. Well, I'm going to plug one of my articles first, which is called Post-Colonial Paths of Pop, a Suburban Psychogeography of George Michael and Wham. And this was a paper I wrote with a friend of mine who's a very eminent music professor. And we were faced with trying to research. We were looking at geography and space and how this fed, how post-coloniality, a term which you may or may not know, how that fed into the kind of history and the story of a particular pop group. In this case, it was Wham. Okay, so we were looking at the backgrounds of George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley, the two founding members of that particular group. And one of the things that we found we would get a little bit stuck if we just looked at conventional theory, and there's a lot of it in relation to post-colonial studies that we could draw upon, and we did draw upon it, and also popular music studies. How could we kind of get in touch with the subject that we really wanted to explore? And one of the areas that I drew on was, in this regard, was psychogeography. And this is very much the idea that you can explore and map the outside world in a way that kind of sets up real physical coordinates to the research you're doing. So, for instance, we were looking at George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley. So we decided to walk extensively around Bushey, which is near Watford, and where these two lads grew up. And we created our own map of all the key places. And we found that the process of walking, talking and discussing was a really valuable addition to all of the kind of desk research that we had done. And it opened up all kinds of areas that we wouldn't necessarily have thought of. And psychogeography is not necessarily one of the most established methodologies, if a methodology at all. It's just something that comes out of a series of books that have been written by people like Peter Ackroyd and Ian Sinclair and writers like that. It's not even a formal kind of academic method of study. Nonetheless, I have found it useful. I've written in my article on WAM, but also in writing other things completely unrelated. I've written an article, also a book chapter on the smart city as well. And again, I drew upon this methodology that took me completely outside of my normal research box. So that's my hot research hint, with an emphasis more upon the outside environment and the space that we inhabit and which we live in. A more kind of informal, I guess, environment, which you can introduce and marry with other things from within academia as a way of energizing your own research and widening your kind of thoughts in relation to a particular subject.
That's great, Adrian. I really like that one. I think that's really valuable, and definitely a big fan of integrating doing things outdoors. I think that there's something in the air, right, where you're outside, you get the fresh air, and it just brings fresh perspective. So yeah, really valuable. Kent, before we come on to you and your masterclass, just a quick reminder to all of you that this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, who are publishers of professional development books and resources that support really great teaching and learning in schools all over the world. So visit the johncattbookshop.com, which is the website where you can explore the full range of titles. And if you want to get 20% off your first order, you can use the code JCTTR2425. So Kent, what do you have to teach us?
So I'm going to teach you a technique which is applicable in business, but it's also applicable in every aspect of life, and that is the pre-mortem. It's one of my favorite things to do. You can do a pre-mortem over a couple of hours. You can do a pre-mortem in 30 seconds. So for those of you who haven't heard of a pre-mortem, if a post-mortem is figuring out what killed something, you might, know them from cop shows, the murder victim, they always do a post-mortem, what killed this person. A pre-mortem is figuring out what might kill something. So a lot of the things that we look at in business are big risky moves that a company might need to make. Either they're going to change their strategic direction or pursue a new product line, or maybe just there's a big complex project, to bring two businesses together. And obviously, these things can fail in lots and lots and lots of different ways. And one of the ways that businesses will do that is collect risks. They'll collect a register of risks, and they'll say, okay, what are the things that could cause this project to fail? And they'll think about, what those things might be, and then they might develop plans to mitigate those risks. But some researchers in the late 80s, and so I can even cite this. This is a piece of research by Mitchell and Russo and Pennington that came from an academic journal, found that you would get better results about predicting what the likely outcomes were if you pretend the thing has already happened. So instead of saying, we're going camping for the weekend, Seema and Adrian, we're going camping for the weekend, what could go wrong? Let's think about what could go wrong so that we can come up with some risk mitigation. What we think about is, we think about it backwards. We say, okay, let's pretend it's a Monday morning after we've been camping, and our camping trip was an unmitigated failure. It was awful. We hated it. We got no pleasure out of the weekend. We hate each other, and we're never going camping again. What went wrong? And weirdly, by pretending that it's already happened and looking backwards on the scenario that hasn't happened yet, this imaginary scenario, groups of humans are much more likely to come to accurate pictures of what the outcome is likely to be. They're much more less likely to have a confidence bias. There's also a whole bunch of reasons why this creates a whole bunch of psychological safety within groups that typically have low safety, because it creates a space to talk about problems, it creates a space to talk about risk, it creates a space for people to surface challenges that have otherwise been difficult to surface because of the political arrangement in the room. So a pre-mortem is just looking at something that hasn't happened yet, but pretending it has happened, and then thinking about what might cause it to go wrong. And then you take the group's opinion. Okay, we think that the biggest things that are likely to go wrong are it's going to rain, or we get lost, or that we forget, a key item of camping paraphernalia. So that allows us to create a risk mitigation strategy. If we think those are the things most likely to go wrong, then we can double down on mitigating those risks by making sure that we've all got Google Maps loaded on our phone, that we make sure we've got, lots of wet weather gear, and that we make sure that before we pack our tents, we go through and we check everything in them, because we think one of the biggest risks is that we miss a key item. So that's how you do a pre-mortem. And like I said, I do it for family holidays. You can do it for wedding proposals. You can do it for big house moves. You can also do it for big strategic moves in business, or even just, should I ask this person out on a date?
I love that. Yeah, I was going to say that I bet you can just apply that to a whole bunch of different scenarios, and yeah, it would be a pretty useful thing to do. I'd never heard of a pre-mortem, so I like that one. I'm going to add that into my own toolkit. Thanks, Ken. So yeah, this has been great. Thank you both for coming on and having, I think, what was a really interesting and valuable discussion. So yeah, thank you both, and have a good night.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused